"The state is us," said the Roman senators. But someone else was supposed to pay for it. Picture the year 370 AD. Rome still stands. The forum buzzes with lawyers and merchants. Thousands of people sweat in the great public baths. Sacrifices are made on the Capitoline Hill. The empire feels eternal, marble, solid, rich beyond imagining. And yet, in a senator's townhouse on the Aventine Hill, an aging patrician named Quintus Aurelius Symmachus is dictating a letter to his estate manager in Campania. He owns 17 rural estates scattered across several provinces. He keeps 3,000 slaves. His annual income amounts to roughly 2,000 pounds of gold. That is the revenue of a medium-sized city. How much of it flows to the state? Almost nothing. This is where the story of how a great civilization destroyed itself begins, not with barbarian swords, but with its own financial architecture. The fall of the Western Roman Empire is one of the most analyzed events in all of human history, and yet the fiscal dimension of that collapse, the specific, grinding, structural failure of the state to extract revenue from those who held the most wealth, remains underappreciated in popular imagination. We tend to picture Rome falling to horsemen from the steppe, to Gothic warriors pouring across frozen rivers, to the dramatic sack of the eternal city itself. All of that happened. But it happened to a state that was already hollow, already broke, already unable to pay the soldiers who were supposed to stop it. To understand the mechanics of catastrophe, we need to understand how Roman taxation worked in the late period, roughly the 3rd through 5th centuries, and, more importantly, how it stopped working. The late Roman tax system rested on 2 main pillars. The first was the iugatio, a land tax calculated according to the quality, size, and productivity of agricultural land. The second was the capitatio, a poll tax levied on agricultural laborers and artisans. In theory, both applied to everyone. In practice, everyone was a concept with extraordinary flexibility. The senatorial class, roughly 2,000 families distributed across the empire, possessed privileges that amounted in effect to near immunity. They paid a separate levy called the folis, whose rate was fixed and bore no relationship to actual wealth. The richest man in Rome paid exactly the same fixed sum as a modest provincial notable of middling means. This was not a progressive tax structure, it was an actively regressive one. The more you had, the smaller a fraction of it you surrendered to the state. But the formal structure was only part of the problem. The more corrosive mechanism was something called patrocinium, patronage. Small landowners, crushed by taxation and unable to defend themselves against predatory tax collectors, would place themselves and their land under the formal protection of a powerful magnate. Legally, the land remained theirs. In practice, it had become part of the patron's sphere, and crucially, the tax obligations attached to that land had a remarkable tendency to evaporate. No tax collector, however determined, was eager to press claims against an estate that fell under the shadow of a man with connections in Constantinople or Milan. This phenomenon, commendatio, the formal act of placing oneself under a patron's protection, has been identified by modern historians as one of the central mechanisms of late Roman fiscal disintegration. Peter Heather, in his landmark 2006 work, The Fall of the Roman Empire, and Brian Ward Perkins in The Fall of Rome and the End of Civilization, 2005, both emphasize how the progressive withdrawal of taxable land from the state's reach hollowed out the revenue base over generations. More recent scholarship, including work by Kyle Harper, Chris Wickham, and the ongoing Oxford Roman Economy Project, has refined and deepened this picture, making clear that what happened was not a sudden shock, but a slow structural hemorrhage. There was a second problem that deserves its own examination, the flight of the curiales. The curiales were the urban middling aristocracy, the men who ran cities, maintained aqueducts, organized games, and most critically, collected taxes. They stood between the imperial state and the individual taxpayer. They were personally liable for delivering the required sum. If a peasant could not pay, the curial made up the difference from his own pocket. This was the system. For generations, it had worked because serving as a curial carried genuine honor and social status. Being on the city council, the curia, meant you were somebody. Then it stopped meaning that. By the 4th century, the curials were trapped. Their obligations grew while their resources dwindled. The greatest landowners above them, the senators, the imperial favorites, the powerful patrons, had escaped the system. The largest burdens fell on those least able to carry them. And so the curials ran. Some enlisted in the army, which granted exemption from curial obligations. Some took holy orders. The church offered similar protection. Some purchased senatorial rank outright, since that rank came with its own set of immunities. The imperial government issued decree after decree trying to seal these exits. Curials were forbidden to enter the clergy. Curials were forbidden to sell their land. They were, in the grimly direct language of late Roman legislation, bound to their cities as surely as peasants were being bound to their fields. The Theodosian Code, The massive legal compilation issued in 438 AD contains dozens of imperial constitutions on this subject, issued by a succession of emperors across more than a century. The very fact that the same prohibitions had to be reissued again and again in slightly varied language by emperor after emperor tells us everything we need to know about their effectiveness. They did not work, the curiales disappeared, cities decayed, taxes went uncollected, and the money that should have paid the soldiers on the Rhine and the Danube stayed in the provinces, in the hands of people who had learned, one way or another, to make themselves invisible to the state. Meanwhile, what was happening on the great estates? Here the story becomes genuinely astonishing, because the late Roman Empire, the same entity that was slowly losing its grip on taxation, the same state that was struggling to field armies, was simultaneously the setting for one of the most extraordinary episodes of aristocratic cultural flourishing in Western history. The great villas of the 4th and early 5th centuries are not what you would expect from an empire in terminal decline. They are vast. They are ornate. They have mosaic floors of extraordinary quality, private bath complexes, libraries, landscaped gardens, fish ponds, and formal dining rooms designed to impress. The archaeological record from the last 30 years, surveys in Britain, Gaul, Spain, and North Africa, consistently shows that the peak of villa construction and decoration in the western provinces coincides almost exactly with the peak of the empire's fiscal difficulties. The late 3rd and 4th centuries see a building boom on aristocratic estates even as cities crumble and border forts are abandoned. The men who lived in these villas left us their words. Ausonius of Bordeaux, a poet, teacher, and eventually a consul, wrote a famous poem about his journey down the Moselle River, a rhapsody of beautiful country houses and productive vineyards. Sidonius Apollinaris, a Gallic aristocrat writing in the mid-5th century as the Western Empire was collapsing around him, produced letter after elegant letter describing dinners, hunting trips, library acquisitions, and the pleasures of refined conversation. Letters written in a Latin so polished and elusive that modern scholars have to work to understand the references. These men were not unaware of the crisis. Sidonius writes with palpable anxiety about the Visigothic King Euric advancing on Clermont. He knows what is happening. He is frightened, but his estate is still there. His library is still there. The wealth is still there. It just is not in the state treasury. This is not a metaphor for Roman decline. It is the mechanism of Roman decline made visible. The concentration of private wealth in an era of public poverty was not incidental to the collapse. It was the collapse, expressed in stone and mosaic and the perfectly turned hexameters of men who would not be alive to see the consequences. Officials who tried to change this encountered a wall of political reality so solid it might as well have been marble. Consider the dynamics faced by any conscientious tax assessor in a late Roman province. His job was to compile the cadastral registers, the land surveys that determined how much each estate owed. To do this accurately, he would need to challenge the declarations of the great landowners, audit their estates, and potentially overrule the assessments that had been quietly arranged by his predecessors. This meant making enemies of men with connections to the imperial court, the senior military, and the provincial governor's office. It meant, in practical terms, risking prosecution on fabricated charges of corruption or extortion, charges that the people he was investigating had every incentive to bring. We have evidence of exactly this dynamic from multiple sources. Church records, legal documents, and the letters of the period all show a pattern. Officials who pressed too hard against elite tax avoidance found themselves facing counter-accusations. The machinery of Roman law, which was genuinely sophisticated and impressive in its formal structure, could be turned with remarkable ease by those with sufficient resources. A senator who wanted to destroy a troublesome tax collector had many tools available, and a tax collector who wanted to survive had every reason to look elsewhere. The result, across generations, was a system of assessment that had less and less relationship to actual wealth. The registers showed one thing, reality showed another. The gap between them was the space where the empire died. The Roman army was money made flesh. It always had been. A legionary of the late empire received a salary, equipment, food, medical care, and, upon retirement, either a land grant or a cash settlement. All of this cost an enormous amount. By most modern estimates, somewhere between 60 and 75% of all late imperial government expenditure went to maintaining the military. This was not unusual for a pre-modern state. What was unusual was the scale. When tax revenues fall, the army is the first thing to suffer. Not because administrators want it that way, but because the military is where the money goes. Cut the revenue and you cut the army. There is no other option. Let us follow this chain of consequences in detail, because it runs through the entire late Roman period and ends in 476 with a boy emperor being sent to a country villa with a pension. The first step in the chain was monetary debasement. In the 3rd century, the period historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, roughly 235 to 284 AD, a succession of military emperors fighting constant civil wars and external invasions, faced a simple problem: not enough money to pay enough soldiers to win enough battles. Their solution was equally simple and equally disastrous: debase the currency. The silver denarius, which under Augustus had been nearly pure silver, fell to a silver content of around 2 to 5% by the 270s. It was, in effect, a bronze coin with a thin silver wash. Soldiers noticed. Merchants noticed. Prices rose as the real value of currency fell, and the legionaries' pay, though nominally unchanged in the number of coins received, bought less and less. Diocletian, who became emperor in 284 and governed until 305, attempted the most ambitious economic intervention of the ancient world. His edict on maximum prices, issued in 301, tried to fix the prices of thousands of goods and services across the entire empire. It failed, as all such edicts fail, because the underlying problem, too much debased currency chasing too few goods, could not be solved by legal proclamation. But Diocletian left behind something more durable: a reorganized tax system and a gold coin, the aureus, that began the transition to the currency stability his successor would complete. That successor was Constantine, who introduced the solidus in around 312 AD. The solidus was a gold coin of consistent purity, 4.5 grams of essentially pure gold, and it would remain the standard currency of the Eastern Empire for 7 centuries. It is rightly described as one of the most successful monetary instruments in history. Byzantine merchants were still using a direct descendant of the Constantinian solidus in the 11th century. But the solidus solved the monetary problem only for those who had gold. The peasant who sold grain, the artisan who made pots, the soldier who received his pay, their world was dominated not by gold, but by the increasingly chaotic small change economy of bronze coins. More importantly for our story, soldiers increasingly received not cash, but annona, compulsory deliveries of food, clothing, and equipment drawn from the tax obligations of agricultural land. When that land was being absorbed into great senatorial estates and its tax obligations were disappearing, the annona shrank too. The army felt the pinch first in its stomach, then in its wallet, then in its weapons. The second step was barbarization. When citizen recruitment dried up, when the salary was too low, the service too dangerous, and the possibility of buying one's way out of military service too readily available, the army turned to barbarians. This was not a new development. The Romans had recruited non-citizens into auxiliary units since the Republic. Under Augustus, Gallic cavalry, Germanic infantry, and Pannonian archers had all served Rome with distinction. The principle was sound: use the military talents available regardless of origin. What changed in the 4th and 5th centuries was the scale and the nature of the arrangement. The men who now entered Roman service were not individuals seeking to Romanize themselves and earn citizenship. They came in tribal groups, under their own leaders, speaking their own languages, fighting in their own style. The Federati, Federate troops who served under treaty rather than direct imperial command, became increasingly central to late Roman military power. Their commanders received enormous donativa, irregular bonuses in gold, to keep their loyalty. This gold, again, came from the treasury, and it was gold that went straight back out of the fiscal system into the hands of warlords whose loyalty lasted precisely as long as the payments did. The most powerful figures of the late Western Empire were, without exception, of barbarian origin or barbarian connection. Stilicho, who effectively ran the Western Empire from 395 to 408 and saved it several times from Gothic invasion, was the son of a Vandal officer. Aetius, who defeated Attila the Hun at the Catalonian plains in 451 in what is often called the last great Roman victory, had grown up as a hostage among the Huns and employed Hunnic mercenaries as his personal army. Ricimer, the power behind a succession of phantom emperors in the 450s and 460s, was half Visigoth and half Swabian. He made and unmade emperors as it pleased him. This was not treachery. These men mostly thought of themselves as Roman. Stilicho died proclaiming his loyalty to Rome and the dynasty he had served. Aetius was murdered by the emperor he had saved. The tragedy is not that barbarians infiltrated a still-functioning Roman system. The tragedy is that, by this point, the system could only function through men like them, because it could no longer afford men of any other kind. The federates were expensive. When the money was late or absent, they helped themselves, to the local population, to the provincial food supply, to whatever was available, which made them, from the perspective of the people they were supposed to protect, nearly indistinguishable from the enemies they were supposedly deterring. The third step was territorial loss and its fiscal consequences. 410 AD, the Visigoths under Alaric sack Rome. 3 days of looting, violence, and humiliation for the city that had called itself the eternal capital of the world. The psychological shock was immense. St. Jerome, writing in Bethlehem, said he could not stop weeping. St. Augustine, in North Africa, began writing The City of God, partly in response to the pagan accusation that Christianity had weakened Rome's divine protection. But in purely strategic terms, the sack of Rome in 410 was recoverable. The city had not been the real capital for decades. Ravenna, more easily defensible in its marshes, had replaced it. The Western Empire still held most of its territories. It was badly shaken. It was not yet broken. What broke it was Africa. In 429, the Vandals under Gaiseric crossed from Spain into North Africa with a force of perhaps 80,000 people, warriors, women, children, and hangers-on. By 439, Gaiseric had taken Carthage, the capital of Roman Africa, and established a Vandal kingdom that controlled the richest agricultural provinces of the western Mediterranean. North Africa, modern Tunisia, coastal Algeria, and the Libyan littoral, was not merely one province among many. It was the breadbasket of the Western Empire. Hundreds of thousands of tons of grain moved from African fields to Italian ports every year. Enormous tax revenues flowed from African estates to the imperial treasury. The great African landowners, despite their own considerable talent for tax avoidance, still contributed more to the state than the corresponding elites of Gaul or Spain. When Gaiseric took Carthage, this revenue stopped completely. In a single decade, the Western Empire lost, by various modern estimates, somewhere between a third and half of its effective tax base. To translate this into contemporary terms, imagine a modern nation losing 30 to 40% of its GDP in 3 years, not through economic downturn, but through the permanent physical conquest of its most productive territory. The response of the Western government was predictable. Try to squeeze more from what remained. Tax pressure on Gaul, Spain, and Italy increased, but these were exactly the regions where the flight into patronage was most advanced, where the curiales were most depleted, where the great senatorial estates were most effective at shielding their wealth from assessment. Increasing the nominal tax rate accomplished little when the mechanisms for collecting it had already disintegrated. The circle was now closed. There was no way out within the existing system. Here we should pause and let a witness speak. His name is Salvian of Marseille. He's a Christian priest writing in the 440s, the decade when Attila was terrorizing the Western Empire. When Roman armies were losing battles they previously would have won easily, when the fiction of effective imperial government was becoming harder and harder to maintain. He writes a treatise called De Gubernatione Dei, on the governance of God, which is, among other things, one of the most devastating pieces of social criticism to survive from the ancient world. Salvian makes an extraordinary claim that ordinary Romans, peasants, small landowners, artisans, were voluntarily going over to the barbarians, not because they admired Gothic culture or Hunnic shamanism, because the barbarians taxed them less, because under Visigothic or Burgundian rule a poor man had a better chance of keeping what little he had than under the supposedly civilized administration of Rome. What else can these poor people do? Salvian writes, paraphrasing here as the full passage is extensive. When the rich press them down and the state destroys them, he describes how small landowners, unable to pay their taxes and unable to find protection, hand over everything to a powerful patron and receive it back as tenants on their own former land. They have, in effect, sold themselves into dependency. They would rather belong to a barbarian king who leaves them alone than to a Roman state that alternately ignores them and crushes them. This is not the voice of a barbarian sympathizer or a romantic. Salvian loves Rome. He mourns what it has become. He is a Christian moralist who genuinely believes the empire is being punished by God for its injustice. But his description of that injustice is precise, sociological, and, compared with what modern archaeology and economic history now tell us, remarkably accurate. The fiscal system had become a machine for transferring wealth upward, from the many to the few, while simultaneously destroying the institutional capacity to use any of that wealth for collective defense. This is the story that Salvian is telling, in the language of his time and his faith. It is the same story that the archaeology tells, in the language of abandoned pottery, shrinking building footprints, and the disappearance of luxury goods from ordinary households. The year 476 has a clean, satisfying quality that history rarely provides. Odoacer, the Germanic commander of what remained of the Western Imperial Army, deposes the last Western emperor, a 16-year-old boy named Romulus Augustulus, the little Augustus, as history would condescendingly remember him, and sends him to live on a comfortable estate in Campania with an annual pension. There is no dramatic last stand. There is no great battle. There is simply a man with soldiers telling a boy with no soldiers that the game is over. The people of the time barely noticed. There was no general mourning, no universal recognition that an era had ended. The senatorial aristocrats in their villas continued writing their polished Latin letters. The church continued functioning. Cities, many of them, continued to exist in some recognizable form. What disappeared was the state as an institution, the centralized apparatus that collected taxes, paid armies, maintained roads, administered law, and projected power across a continental territory. It had not been murdered. It had been starved. To appreciate the full scale of what happened, we need to confront some numbers. imprecise by the standards of modern economic history, but revealing in their order of magnitude. At the height of Roman power under Augustus, imperial revenues amounted to roughly 800 to 900 million sesterces per year, an extraordinary sum that funded an army of some 300,000 men, the construction and maintenance of 80,000 kilometers of roads, hundreds of aqueducts, dozens of major public building programs, and a bureaucracy that administered a territory from Scotland to Mesopotamia. By the mid-5th century, the fiscal reality of the Western Empire had collapsed to a fraction of this. Brian Ward Perkins, one of the most rigorous modern analysts of the late Roman economy, has argued, on the basis of ceramic distribution patterns, building activity, animal bone evidence, and other archaeological proxies for economic vitality, that the Western provinces experienced a genuine and severe economic contraction in the 5th and 6th centuries. This was not merely a political transition, it was a civilizational downturn measurable in the quality of everyday objects. The army that the Western government could actually field in the 420s and 430s, as distinct from the paper strength of official military rosters, was perhaps 20,000 to 30,000 men. The rest were federates, tribal warriors serving under treaty, loyal to their own commanders, paid in gold that the treasury could barely produce. When the gold ran out, they served themselves. Sometimes they became the state. This is not a metaphor. In the 450s and 460s, a man named Ricimer held the real power of the Western Empire. He was a general, not an emperor. He placed and removed emperors as political convenience dictated, 4 in 12 years. The emperors he chose were chosen for their manageability, not their competence. They were figureheads for a system that no longer had the resources to be a system. The money had run out, the army had melted away, the borders had become, in practice, negotiated zones of partial control rather than defended lines. The Western Empire, in its final decades, was less a state than a gradually dissolving claim on a territory that increasingly belonged to others. At this point, it is worth engaging seriously with the historiographical debate, because the question of why Rome fell is genuinely contested and genuinely important. Edward Gibbon, writing in the 18th century, gave us the canonical narrative. Rome was undermined by Christianity, which sapped martial virtue and diverted resources from defense to the church, and then overwhelmed by barbarian migrations that the weakened empire could no longer resist. This narrative shaped 2 centuries of historical thinking. Modern scholarship is considerably more complex. Peter Heather, in his magisterial 2006 reconstruction, places primary emphasis on external pressure, specifically on the arrival of the Huns from Central Asia, who, like a great billiard ball, set the other peoples of the steppe and forest in motion. Without the Huns, the Visigoths might have remained beyond the Danube. Without the Visigoth crisis, Stilicho might not have stripped the Rhine frontier of troops. Without the stripped Rhine frontier, the catastrophic crossing of the Rhine in 406, when Vandals, Alans, and Suebi poured into Gaul, might not have happened. Walter Goffert and the accommodationist school, influential since the 1980s, argue that the barbarian settlements were not conquests at all, but negotiated arrangements in which Germanic leaders took over fiscal obligations, tax revenues, from the Roman state in exchange for military service. On this reading, there was no real fall, just a gradual transformation of administrative structures. Ward Perkins pushes back hard against this optimistic reading with his archaeological data. The pottery gets worse, the buildings get smaller, the animals get shorter. Literally, since animal bone evidence shows a reduction in average cattle size that reflects reduced agricultural investment and nutrition. Something genuinely catastrophic happened to the material conditions of life in the western provinces between 400 and 600 AD. You cannot explain that away with euphemisms about transformation. Kyle Harper's 2017 work. The fate of Rome adds a dimension that previous historians underweighted: climate and disease. The Roman climate optimum, the unusually warm and stable climatic period that supported high agricultural productivity across the Mediterranean, began deteriorating in the late 2nd century. A series of devastating pandemic events, the Antonine Plague of the 2nd century, the Plague of Cyprian in the 3rd, and eventually the Justinianic Plague of the 6th, killed enormous fractions of the population, disrupted agriculture, and contracted the tax base in ways that had nothing to do with senatorial evasion. All of these factors are real. None of them is sufficient alone, and none of them changes the fundamental reality that the state sat at the center of the collapse. A state that could not extract sufficient resources from the people who possessed those resources, and therefore could not do the one thing that states exist to do, which is to defend the people living under them. The contrast with the Eastern Empire is instructive and underappreciated. The Eastern Roman Empire, based in Constantinople, controlling Egypt, Anatolia, Syria, Greece, and the Balkans, did not fall in 476. It did not fall for another 1,000 years, surviving until the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453. This is one of history's most remarkable institutional survivals, and it demands explanation. Part of the explanation is geographic. The Eastern Empire held more defensible frontiers on the Bosphorus, the Taurus Mountains, the deserts of Mesopotamia, and Constantinople itself was virtually impregnable for centuries. Part of the explanation is economic. The eastern provinces were wealthier, more urbanized, and more commercially active than the western ones. Egypt alone generated fiscal revenues that dwarfed what the West could extract from all its territories combined. But part of the explanation is institutional. The Eastern bureaucracy was more robust, more professional, and more capable of asserting state authority against private wealth. Constantinople was better at actually taxing its elites. Not perfectly, not without constant struggle and evasion, but sufficiently better than the West to make a decisive difference. This is not a trivial observation. The same civilizational inheritance, the same legal tradition, the same military challenges, the same barbarian pressure, and yet one half survived and one half collapsed. The difference lay, at least in significant part, in the capacity of the state to mobilize the resources of the wealthy in its own defense. The West failed this test. The East, imperfectly and at great cost, passed it. Let us return to the human level, because this story is not just about fiscal mechanisms and archaeological proxies. It is about people making choices, and those choices having consequences that rippled across centuries. In 455, the Vandals under Gaiseric sail from Carthage to Rome. For 2 weeks, they systematically stripped the city of its remaining portable wealth. They load the treasures of the Temple of Solomon, brought to Rome by Titus after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, onto their ships. They take the Empress Eudoxia and her daughters as hostages. They take gold, silver, ivory, silk, and 5 centuries of accumulated imperial plunder. They are able to do this because there is no Roman fleet to stop them, no army to defend the city, no organized resistance of any kind. The Roman navy, which had once controlled the entire Mediterranean, had been allowed to deteriorate to the point of irrelevance. The money for its maintenance had not been there. The money for the army to defend it had not been there either. The money was in the villas. In that same decade, somewhere in southern Gaul, Sidonius Apollinaris is writing a panegyric for a new emperor. One of several emperors he will praise over the course of his long and adaptable career. Sidonius is a brilliant man, a genuine literary talent, a devoted Christian who will eventually become the Bishop of Clermont and organize the defense of his city against the Visigothic King Euric with genuine courage. He is not a villain. He is, in many ways, an admirable figure. But he is also the embodiment of a system that could not save itself. His wealth is intact. His literary culture is intact. His social network is intact. What is not intact is the state that created the conditions for all of it. There's a final image worth holding. Along the Rhine and Danube frontiers in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, the Roman military presence can be traced in the physical record. Coins, military equipment, the foundations of barrack buildings. Scholars studying these frontier zones, including the extensive work done on the limes, the Roman frontier system, which has been an ongoing subject of major archaeological research projects across Germany, Austria, and Romania, have found a consistent and quietly devastating pattern. The latest coin deposits at many frontier forts date to the very early 5th century. After that, nothing. The sites are simply abandoned. Some show signs of people waiting, coin hoards that were never retrieved, repair work started and not finished, the physical traces of a garrison that expected resupply, expected relief, expected to be paid, and received nothing. They waited. The convoys did not come. The money did not arrive. Eventually they left, or died, or became someone else's men. The money was on the mosaic floors of Italian villas. It was in the personal treasury of Symmachus, who owned 17 estates and paid a fixed tax, regardless of what those estates produced. It was in the hands of the senatorial class that had, over a century and a half of quiet, individually rational choices, dismantled the fiscal foundation of the civilization they claimed to represent. Historians are right to warn against crude analogies between ancient and modern societies. Rome is not any contemporary state. The institutional landscape is different. The technologies of governance are different. The possibilities of resistance, transparency, and democratic accountability are different in ways that matter. And yet the structural logic of the Roman fiscal collapse has a clarity that transcends its particular historical context. States exist on taxes. Taxes are paid by those who cannot avoid them. When a system allows the wealthiest and most politically connected to exit the tax burden, whether through formal legal privileges, political patronage, regulatory capture, or the simple corruption of assessment, the costs of collective goods fall entirely on those without the connections or resources to escape. Those people are squeezed harder. Some leave, some fall into dependency. The state's revenue-based contracts, its capacity to provide defense, infrastructure, and justice deteriorates. The deterioration makes the state less worth contributing to, which accelerates the flight of those who can afford to flee, which accelerates the deterioration. The Romans had a word, res publica, that meant literally the public thing, the thing that belongs to all. The late Roman aristocracy was not opposed to the res publica in theory. They celebrated it in their speeches. They invoked it in their letters. They named their sons after the great figures who had built it. They just did not want to pay for it. This was not villainy. Most of them were doing what people do, protecting their own interests within the rules as they found them, using the tools available, passing on whatever advantages they could to their children. The system rewarded evasion and punished honesty. Individuals responded to the incentives the system created. The aggregate result was catastrophic. Symmachus wrote magnificent letters. Sidonius composed exquisite poetry. The soldiers on the frontier waited in their crumbling forts for pay that never came. History remembers all three, just differently. The villas eventually fell too. Not right away. Some survived for generations as the centers of early medieval estates, the nuclei around which feudal relationships would slowly crystallize over the following centuries. But the world they represented, the world of sophisticated urban culture, long-distance trade, reliable coinage, and reasonably effective law, that world contracted sharply and did not recover in the West for 500 years. The mosaics are still beautiful. You can see them in museums across Europe. Intricate geometric patterns, hunting scenes, mythological tableaux, all testifying to the extraordinary skill of the craftsmen who made them and the extraordinary wealth of the men who commissioned them. What you cannot see in the museums is what those villas cost, not in money, in everything else, in the soldiers who went unpaid, in the roads that went unrepaired, in the border forts that went undermanned, in the generations of ordinary people who lived shorter, harder, smaller lives, in the centuries after the system they had been promised, the system that was supposed to protect them in exchange for their taxes and their labor and their sons, quietly collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. That is the true price of the mosaics, and that is the story of the empire that could not tax the rich. This narrative draws on current historical scholarship as of 2025-2026, including the work of Peter Heather, Brian Ward Perkins, Kyle Harper, Chris Wickham, and Walter Goffert, as well as findings from contemporary archaeological research into late Roman frontier sites and villa complexes across Western Europe and North Africa.